I used to think that the most dangerous thing between two people was closeness. I was wrong. Closeness can be measured. You can feel when someone is getting near. You can recognize the distance disappearing. You can see the moments becoming longer, the conversations becoming deeper, the silence becoming less uncomfortable. There are signs. There are stages. There are usually enough warnings to know when something is changing. What I didn't understand was that the real danger isn't someone getting close to you. It's someone becoming familiar with the parts of you that you never intentionally showed them. That happens differently, quickly, without announcement, without the dramatic moment where everything changes at once. It happens so gradually that you only recognize it after the fact. You look back and realize that somewhere between one conversation and another, somewhere between the things you said and the things you chose not to say, someone stopped feeling like an outside presence. They became part of the internal landscape. And that is where you became difficult to explain, because I can explain attraction. I can explain curiosity. I can explain admiration. I can even explain why someone might occupy my thoughts more often than they should. Those things have names. They have familiar patterns. People experience them every day. But this is different. This feels less like something that happened to me and more like something that revealed itself through me, as if it had been forming underneath everything long before I had enough awareness to recognize it. And I think that's what unsettles me most. Not that you became important, but that I didn't notice when it happened. I'm usually aware of changes. I notice shifts in people. I notice when someone's tone changes. I notice when a conversation becomes more careful. I notice when someone starts choosing their words differently around me. I notice distance. I notice hesitation. I notice intention. I've always been good at reading what exists underneath what people actually say. It's one of the ways I protect myself. I observe before I respond. I understand before I trust. I create distance before I allow someone to have the ability to affect me. That system has worked for a long time. It has kept things organized, predictable, manageable. People can only reach what you allow them to reach. That was the rule. And then you appeared without behaving like someone who wanted access. That changed everything. You weren't trying to get past anything. You weren't asking questions designed to uncover me. You weren't you weren't demanding explanations for the parts of me that remained quiet. You didn't seem interested in taking anything from me. And somehow that made it impossible for me to keep you at a distance. Because distance works when someone is trying to cross it. You can recognize the attempt, you can stop it, you can reinforce the boundary. But what do you do when someone doesn't cross the boundary at all? What do you do when they simply make the boundary feel unnecessary? That is what happened. You never forced your way into my world. You simply became someone I no longer experienced as entirely outside it. There's a difference, a significant one, and I didn't understand it immediately. At first, I thought I was simply paying attention. I thought there was something unusual about the way you communicated, the way you noticed small things, the way you didn't rush to respond just because silence existed, the way you seemed capable of understanding what was underneath a sentence instead of only hearing the sentence itself. I noticed it, but I didn't assign meaning to it. I told myself that some people simply communicate differently. Some people are more observant. Some people naturally notice details. Some people understand silence better than others. That explanation was comfortable, so I kept it for a while until there were too many moments that didn't fit inside it. One moment can be coincidence, two can be interesting, three can be a pattern. After that, you have to start asking yourself whether you're actually looking at something real. And I didn't want to ask, because questions have consequences. Once you ask yourself what something means, you can't always return to the version of yourself that didn't wonder. So I avoided the question, not consciously. At least, not at first. I simply kept moving, kept talking, kept observing, kept pretending that whatever was happening didn't need to be named. But something had already shifted. I started noticing that I remembered things about you that I normally wouldn't remember about people. Not because I was trying to, because they stayed certain words, certain reactions, certain pauses, the way you approached something, the way you avoided something, the way you could say very little and somehow leave more behind than someone else could leave after an hour of explaining themselves. I began carrying those details without realizing I was carrying them. They would return at unexpected moments. A thought would appear and somehow remind me of you. A sentence someone else said would make me think about the way you would have understood it. A situation would unfold, and I would instinctively imagine your perspective before I even realized I was doing it. That was the first real sign. Not that I was thinking about you, but that my thinking had started making room for you. And those are not the same thing. Thinking about someone is temporary. You think, you remember, you move on. But when someone becomes part of your thinking itself, they stop existing only as a memory or a person you remember. They become a reference point, a quiet, internal comparison, a perspective you consult without consciously deciding to consult it. That is something else entirely. And I didn't like how natural it felt, because natural things are often the hardest to resist. If something feels wrong, you can reject it. If something feels dangerous, you can step away. If something feels forced, you can recognize the pressure. But what if something feels right without giving you a reason? What if there is no argument to fight? No obvious problem to solve? No warning loud enough to justify leaving? What if the only thing that scares you is how easily something fits? That was my problem with you. You fit, not into my life in some obvious, dramatic way, not into a role, not into a category. You fit somewhere quieter, somewhere much more difficult to protect, inside the way I process things, inside the way I notice things, inside the way I interpret moments that most people would never think twice about. And once I noticed that, I started questioning everything. Was I imagining it? Was I assigning meaning where there was none? Was I mistaking familiarity for connection? Was I simply projecting something I wanted to be true? I questioned myself because I've learned that certainty can be dangerous when it comes too quickly. But the more I questioned it, the more obvious the answer became. Because imagination usually needs maintenance. You have to keep feeding it, keep interpreting things in its favor, keep ignoring contradictions. This didn't require that. If anything, the more objectively I looked at it, the harder it became to dismiss. There was something there, something consistent, something neither of us seemed to have deliberately created. And maybe that is why it felt so strange, because I understand things that are built, I understand effort, I understand intention, I understand relationships that develop through repeated decisions. You do something, the other person responds, you move closer, they meet you there. Trust grows, understanding grows, history accumulates, and eventually something meaningful exists. That makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense is when understanding appears before history, when recognition comes before familiarity, when someone seems to understand the shape of something inside you before you've given them enough information to reasonably understand it. That is what happened here, and I still don't know how to explain it. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe explanation is sometimes just another way of trying to make something less powerful. We name things because names create boundaries. We define things because definitions make them easier to control. But some connections become smaller when you force them into language too quickly. Maybe this is one of them, because every time I try to reduce it to one word, the word feels incomplete. Friendship doesn't explain it. Attraction doesn't explain it. Understanding doesn't explain it. Familiarity doesn't explain it. Even connection feels too general. There is something more specific happening, something quieter, something more internal, something that doesn't depend on how often we speak or how much time we spend together. That might be the strangest part. It doesn't need constant attention to remain present. It doesn't disappear when the conversation ends. It doesn't weaken simply because life becomes busy. It stays. And I've started realizing that some things don't need to be loud to be permanent. There are things that announce themselves and disappear just as quickly, and then there are things that barely announce themselves at all. They simply settle. They become part of you. You don't notice them every second, but they're there. And when you finally try to remove them, you realize they've already become connected to too many other things. That is what I mean when I say, you changed something. You didn't change me directly. You didn't tell me to become different. You didn't ask me to open up. You didn't convince me to trust you. You didn't challenge me to become softer. You simply existed in a way that made certain parts of me respond differently. And that is much more powerful than influence. Influence can be resisted. Impact is different. Impact happens before resistance gets the chance to begin. You didn't persuade me. You affected me. And I think there's an important difference between those two things. Persuasion requires a choice. Impact sometimes happens before the choice exists. That is why I keep returning to the same realization. I didn't decide that you would matter. I simply noticed that you already did. There is a strange honesty in realizing something after it has already happened. You can't negotiate with the past. You can't tell yourself that you should have noticed sooner. You can't undo a realization simply because you don't like what it implies. Once you know, and I know now. I know that your presence has changed the way certain moments feel. I know that some silences feel different because I know you understand them. I know that certain thoughts seem incomplete until I imagine how you might see them. I know that there are things I would normally keep entirely internal that somehow feel less necessary to hide when I imagine you understanding them. And I know that none of this was planned. That matters, because planned things can be controlled. This wasn't. It happened in the spaces where neither of us was trying to make anything happen. That is where the most honest things usually live, not in declarations, not in dramatic gestures, not in carefully chosen moments, but in the ordinary seconds where you realize someone has started affecting you without ever asking for the privilege. That is where you found me. Not in the version of myself I show people, not in the version that knows what to say, not in the version that has already prepared its answers. you reached something underneath that. Something quieter, something I don't usually let anyone see. And I don't think you even realized you were doing it. Maybe that's why I couldn't resist it. There was no performance, no attempt, no strategy. You weren't trying to understand me. You simply did, or perhaps you didn't understand everything. Maybe that's an important distinction. Maybe what you understood wasn't every detail of me. Maybe you understood the structure underneath the details, the way I think, the way I withdraw, the way I become quiet when something matters too much, the way I analyze instead of immediately reacting, the way I protect what I care about by pretending it doesn't affect me. Those things are difficult to explain, but somehow you seem to recognize them. And recognition is intimate in a way people underestimate. Being seen is one thing. Being recognized is something else. Being seen means someone notices you. Being recognized means something in them responds to what they notice. It means there is a familiarity that exists without a shared history. And perhaps that is why being understood by you feels strangely personal, because it doesn't feel like you learned me. It feels like you recognized me. And I don't know which is more unsettling, maybe both, because learning can be explained, recognition cannot always be. You can say how you learned someone. You can identify the conversations, the experiences, the moments that built your understanding. But recognition? Sometimes it simply arrives. You meet someone, and something in you becomes quiet, not excited, not overwhelmed, quiet, as if a part of you has stopped searching. That is how this feels. Not like discovering something completely new, more like finding something that somehow feels familiar despite being new, and that contradiction has stayed with me. Because how can something feel unfamiliar and familiar at the same time? How can someone be new to your life and yet somehow occupy a place that feels like it was waiting for them? I don't know. Maybe some connections are not built from shared history. Maybe they are built from shared depth, from similar ways of seeing, from similar ways of processing, from the strange recognition of someone who carries a shape of thought that resembles your own. That doesn't mean we are the same. We aren't. And I don't think sameness is what creates this. In fact, it's the differences that make the recognition clearer. You don't mirror me perfectly. You reveal me differently. You make me notice things about myself that I was too close to see, and that might be why you've become so difficult to ignore, because every interaction doesn't just tell me something about you. It tells me something about myself. That is a dangerous kind of connection. When another person becomes a mirror without trying to be one, when their presence makes you aware of parts of yourself that had remained unnoticed. You didn't create those parts. You exposed them. And there is a difference. I used to think that the people who changed us were the ones who gave us something. Now I think sometimes they are the ones who make us notice what was already there. That is what you did. You didn't give me a new way of thinking. You made me aware of a way of thinking I had already been carrying. You didn't give me depth. You made me recognize it. You didn't create the silence. You made me understand why I had always been comfortable inside it. And somehow, knowing that makes this feel even more significant. Because if you had simply introduced something new into my life, maybe I could remove it. But if you revealed something that already belonged to me, then removing you wouldn't remove what you revealed. It would only leave me knowing it existed. And that changes the equation. I could walk away. Of course I could. People walk away from meaningful things every day, sometimes because they have to, Sometimes because they are afraid, sometimes because timing is wrong, sometimes because staying would demand more courage than leaving, but leaving wouldn't make this unreal. It would only make it unfinished. And there is a difference between something ending and something being abandoned. I think I've always preferred endings. At least endings have structure. You know where you stand. You know what happened. You can close the door. You can put the memory somewhere safe. You can move forward. But unfinished things are different. They remain active. They return when you least expect them. They ask questions you thought you had already answered. They make you wonder what might have happened if you had stayed. And I don't want to become someone who spends years wondering about a connection. I was too afraid to understand. That is why I'm still here. Not because I know exactly what this is. I don't. Not because I know where it leads. I don't. Not because I have some perfect explanation for why you matter. I don't. I'm here because pretending it doesn't matter would be less honest than admitting that it does. And I value honesty more than certainty. Maybe that is another thing you changed. You made me realize that I've been confusing certainty with safety. I thought I needed to know the outcome before I could take a step. I thought understanding the entire path was necessary before allowing myself to move. But life doesn't work that way. Some of the most important decisions happen before the outcome becomes visible. You don't always know where something will lead. Sometimes you only know that remaining exactly where you are is no longer honest. And that is where I am now. I can't return to pretending you are insignificant. I can't go back to seeing this as a passing curiosity. I can't convince myself that the way you affect my thinking is meaningless. Because meaning doesn't disappear simply because you refuse to name it, and maybe naming it isn't even the point. Maybe the point is acknowledging what already exists. There is something between us, something that doesn't need exaggeration, something that doesn't need a dramatic story, something that doesn't become more real because we give it a beautiful name. It simply exists, and perhaps that is enough for now. I've spent too much time trying to understand whether something deserves to exist before allowing it to exist. Maybe some things deserve the chance to reveal themselves. Maybe not everything needs to be solved immediately. Maybe there is value in letting something breathe before deciding what it is. That thought would have terrified me before. Now it feels strangely peaceful, because I'm beginning to understand that control and clarity are not the same thing. I can be clear without controlling the outcome. I can acknowledge what I feel without demanding a future from it. I can recognize your importance without turning it into an expectation. I can let something matter without immediately asking what it means. That is new for me. And maybe that is another reason this connection feels significant. It has changed not only what I think about you, it has changed how I think about myself. I've become more aware of the parts of me that usually hide behind analysis. The part that feels before it explains, the part that notices before it understands, the part that knows something is important before it can provide evidence. I used to distrust that part. Now I listen to it more carefully because sometimes intuition is simply awareness arriving before language. Maybe that is what happened with you. Something in me recognized the significance before my conscious mind had enough information to explain it. And instead of trusting that recognition, I analyzed it. I questioned it. I dissected it. I searched for reasons, but no amount of analysis changed the basic truth. You remained there. The feeling remained. The recognition remained, the impact remained. And eventually, the analysis became unnecessary because some things become clearer the longer you stop trying to make them complicated. You matter. That is the simplest version. You matter in a way I didn't expect. You matter in a way I didn't plan. You matter in a way that has already changed something inside me. And I don't need a more dramatic sentence than that. Maybe the strongest truths are often the quietest. I don't need to say that you are everything. You aren't. I don't need to say that nothing else matters. That wouldn't be true. I don't need to pretend that this connection is perfect. Nothing real is perfect. What I can say is that something about the way we understand each other feels unusually honest. And honesty is rare enough to be protected. That is what I want to protect, not a fantasy, not an expectation, not some imagined future. The honesty, the ability to exist without performing, the ability to be quiet without making silence uncomfortable, the ability to say something imperfect and trust that it won't immediately be reshaped into something else, the ability to be seen without feeling examined. That matters. More than I used to realize. Because most people don't actually want to understand you. They want a version of you that makes sense to them. They want explanations that fit. They want reactions they can predict. They want emotional patterns they know how to navigate. And when you don't fit those expectations, they either try to change you or they decide they understand you anyway. You didn't do either. You left room. That may be the greatest reason I feel safe being understood by you. You don't rush to complete the picture. You allow the unfinished parts to remain unfinished. You don't need every silence translated. You don't need every emotion justified. You don't need every thought explained before you accept that it exists. That kind of understanding is rare. And once you experience it, ordinary interactions start feeling different. Not worse, just louder. People talk more, explain more, dread faster, film every empty space. And suddenly, you realize how valuable it is to be around someone who doesn't need to fill every silence, someone who can simply remain. That is what your presence feels like. Not pressure. Presence. And perhaps those are the two things I've confused for most of my life. I thought someone being important would mean they would demand more of me. More attention, more words, more reassurance, more availability. But you have shown me that importance doesn't necessarily demand anything. Sometimes it simply exists. Sometimes someone can matter deeply without needing to possess any part of you. That kind of connection feels more mature, more honest, less desperate. There is no need to force it. No need to prove it every day. No need to turn it into something dramatic just because it feels significant. It can simply be there. And maybe that is why I trust it more. Because anything that needs constant proof eventually becomes performance. This, this doesn't feel like performance. It feels like recognition. And recognition doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need to be announced. It simply changes the way you see. I see differently now. That is undeniable. I notice more. I question differently. I listen differently. I pause differently. And sometimes when something happens, I catch myself wondering what you would notice about it, not what you would say, what you would notice. That distinction matters, because words are only one form of understanding. Sometimes the deepest connection is not knowing what someone would say. It is knowing what they would notice. What detail would catch their attention, what contradiction they would recognize, what silence they would understand, what part of the situation they would see that everyone else would overlook. That is where I find you in my thinking, not as a voice telling me what to believe, but as a perspective reminding me to look again, and maybe that is why I don't feel controlled by your presence. You don't tell me what to think. You make me think more carefully. You don't replace my perspective, you expand it. That is a completely different kind of influence, and I respect it because I never wanted someone who would simply agree with me. Agreement is easy. Recognition is harder. I wanted someone who could understand why I think the way I do without needing to think exactly the same way. Maybe that is what this is. Two different people recognizing something similar underneath the surface, not identical stories, not identical experiences, not identical personalities. Just a similar internal language, a similar sensitivity to things that other people overlook, a similar awareness of what happens underneath a conversation. And when two people share that kind of structure, maybe understanding can happen faster than expected. Maybe that is why this never felt like we were starting from zero. It felt like there was already context, uh, even when there shouldn't have been, and I still don't know what to call that. I'm beginning to think I don't have to. Some things become less honest when you define them too quickly. If I call this one thing, I may accidentally create expectations that were never there. If I call it nothing, I would be lying. So perhaps I can let it remain what it actually is, something meaningful, something real, something still becoming. There is freedom in that. I don't have to force the future to justify the present. I can appreciate what exists without demanding that it become something else immediately. And yet, I would be lying if I said, I don't wonder where it could go. Of course I wonder. I wonder what happens if we continue. I wonder what happens if this understanding deepens. I wonder what happens when familiarity grows around something that already feels familiar. I wonder whether the strange feeling of recognition becomes ordinary or whether it remains strange. I wonder whether one day we will look back at this period and understand it differently. Maybe we will laugh at how much we analyzed. Maybe we will realize we knew the answer much earlier than we admitted. Maybe we will discover that this was simply the beginning of something neither of us had language for yet. Or maybe it will remain exactly what it is. A connection that mattered, a person who changed something, a moment in life that didn't need to become permanent to be significant. I can accept that possibility too, because I'm learning that permanence is not the only measurement of importance. Some things matter because they happened. Some people matter because they changed the way you saw yourself. Some connections matter because they showed you that a certain kind of understanding was possible. Even if the future changes, even if circumstances change, even if distance appears, the impact remains, and perhaps that is enough. But if I'm being completely honest, there is a part of me that doesn't want this to become just a memory. There is a part of me that wants to see what happens if I stop protecting myself from the possibility, not recklessly, not blindly, just honestly. To stop asking whether I can guarantee the outcome, to stop requiring certainty before allowing myself to participate, to stop standing outside something simply because I'm afraid of what might happen if I step inside. Because maybe the greatest form of control isn't keeping everything away. Maybe it is knowing what you are willing to risk. And I think I'm beginning to understand what I'm willing to risk here. Not everything, not my entire world, not my identity, not my independence, just the illusion that I can remain untouched, because I can't. You already changed that. The question is no longer whether you affected me. You did. The question is whether I'm going to pretend otherwise. And I don't think I can. Not anymore. There is too much awareness now. Too much evidence in my own behavior. Too many moments where I caught myself responding differently. Too many times when your absence somehow had a presence of its own, that phrase would have sounded impossible to me before. Now I understand it. Someone can be absent and still occupy a space, not because you are obsessed, not because you are dependent, simply because they have become meaningful enough that their absence is noticeable. And I noticed. I noticed when you weren't there. I noticed when something happened that I would have wanted to share. I noticed when I had a thought and instinctively wondered how you would interpret it. I noticed when silence felt different because I remembered how easily you could exist inside it. I noticed, and once you start noticing your own noticing, it becomes impossible to pretend. So here is the part I have avoided. You reached me, not dramatically, not forcefully, not by breaking through some wall. You reached me by making the wall unnecessary. And that is a distinction I will probably carry for a long time, because I built those walls for a reason. They weren't there because I hated people. They were there because I learned that being understood incorrectly can hurt more than being misunderstood. I learned that once people think they know you, they stop listening. They start interpreting. They stop asking. They start assuming. So I became careful. Very careful. I learned how to reveal just enough. I learned how to stay readable without becoming exposed. I learned how to be present without becoming accessible. It worked until you. You didn't make me feel exposed. You made me feel accurately seen. Those are not the same thing. Exposure feels unsafe. Recognition can feel strangely peaceful because exposure is losing control of what someone sees. Recognition is realizing that someone saw it correctly. And maybe that is why I didn't pull away. Maybe some part of me recognized that you weren't trying to take anything. You were simply receiving what was already there. That kind of presence doesn't feel invasive. It feels rare. And rare things make you careful. Not because you want to own them, because you don't want to damage them. That is where I am now, careful. Not distant, not closed. Careful, because I know something meaningful exists here, and I don't want to destroy it by forcing it into a shape it isn't ready for. I don't want to rush it. I don't want to romanticize every moment. I don't want to create a story that reality cannot support. I want to let reality speak for itself. If this is real, it will survive honesty. If it is meaningful, it won't require exaggeration. If it is meant to deepen, it will deepen through truth rather than pressure. That is the only way I want to approach it. Slowly, clearly, without pretending, and maybe that is the closest thing to a decision I can make right now. I'm not walking away. I'm not forcing the door open either. I'm simply no longer standing outside, pretending there is nothing behind it. I know there is. I've seen enough. I've felt enough. I've understood enough. And now I'm willing to remain present long enough to see what happens. That might not sound like much. For me, it is. Because staying present, when you don't have control over the outcome, is one of the hardest things I know how to do. I prefer conclusions. I prefer certainty. I prefer knowing what something is before allowing it to affect me. But perhaps life keeps reminding us that some of the most important things cannot be understood from a distance. You have to experience them. You have to remain long enough for the answer to reveal itself. And maybe that is what I'm doing now, waiting without withdrawing. observing without dissecting, feeling without immediately labeling, allowing without surrendering myself. That balance feels unfamiliar, but not wrong. And perhaps unfamiliar does not always mean dangerous. Sometimes it means new, sometimes it means growth. Sometimes it means you have reached the edge of a version of yourself that can no longer contain what you are becoming. Maybe that is what you represent to me, not an escape from myself, not a replacement for anything. A doorway into a part of myself I had stopped visiting, the part that can trust without having every answer, the part that can care without turning care into weakness, the part that can allow someone to matter without immediately preparing for their absence. The part that understands that being affected in us is not the same as being controlled. You didn't take my independence. You challenged my definition of it. I used to think independence meant needing no one. Now, I think it might mean being able to choose connection without losing yourself inside it. There is strength in that, a different kind of strength, one that doesn't come from distance, one that comes from choice. And if I continue choosing to remain here, I want it to be because I am choosing it, not because I'm afraid to leave, not because I'm afraid of being alone, not because I need something from you, because something about this feels worth understanding. That is enough, more than enough, and maybe someday I will be able to explain exactly why. Maybe I'll have the perfect sentence, the perfect definition, the perfect answer to the question of what happened between two people who weren't supposed to understand each other this quickly. But I don't have that sentence yet. All I have is the truth. You became significant without asking to be. You became familiar without having enough history to justify it. You became part of my thinking without ever demanding a place there. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking how to remove you from that space. I started wondering what it would mean to let you remain. That is the difference. That is the shift. That is where I am now. Not trying to escape the connection. Trying to understand what it deserves. Because if something reaches this deeply, it deserves honesty. It deserves patience. It deserves the chance to become whatever it naturally becomes. And perhaps, most importantly, it deserves not to be destroyed by fear. Fear has protected me for a long time. I'm grateful for what it taught me. But I don't want it making every decision anymore. Sometimes fear is information. Sometimes it is simply an old reflex reacting to something new. And I think with you, I've been confusing the two. The fear is real, but that doesn't mean the danger is. There is uncertainty, but uncertainty is not the same as wrongness. There is vulnerability, but vulnerability is not the same as weakness. There is attachment beginning to form, but attachment is not automatically dependence. There is significance, but significance does not have to become possession. I understand those differences now, and understanding them makes it easier to breathe, because I don't need to run from something simply because it matters. I can let it matter. I can remain myself, might. I can keep my boundaries. I can keep my independence, and still allow another person to be important. Maybe that is what healthy connection actually looks like. Not losing yourself in someone, not building walls against them, but allowing two complete people to exist beside each other without either one needing to become smaller. That is what I want. If this continues, that is how I want it to continue. Not through pressure, not through fear, not through constant reassurance, through understanding, through honesty, through the simple decision to keep showing up as ourselves. And perhaps That is why I don't need to know exactly what comes next. For the first time, I'm not sure that knowing would make it better. Maybe the unknown is part of what makes this meaningful. Maybe there is something beautiful about not having every page written before you turn to the next one. Maybe I can finally allow myself to experience something without demanding that it prove its permanence first. You have already changed something in me. That is enough evidence. Not evidence that you belong to me, not evidence that we have some predetermined future. Just evidence that something real happened. Something I can't reduce to coincidence anymore. Something that made me see myself differently. Something that made me question the structures I had treated as permanent. And perhaps that is the real reason you matter. Not because you completed something missing. I was never incomplete. Not because you saved me. I never needed saving. Not because you became my entire world. You didn't. You became a person whose presence revealed another dimension of my world, and that is more honest, more grounded, more real. You reminded me that I can still be surprised. I can still meet someone and discover a kind of understanding I wasn't expecting. I can still be affected. I can still care. I can still let something develop without knowing exactly where it will lead. That matters to me, perhaps more than you realize, because I had become very good at predicting myself. I knew what I would tolerate, what I would reject, when I would leave, when I would close the door, when I would stop responding, when I would decide that something was too complicated. And then you came along and made me question the predictability of my own reactions, not by challenging me, by existing. That is almost funny when I think about it. You didn't have to do anything extraordinary. You simply had to be yourself. And somehow, that was enough to reach somewhere most people never even knew existed. So, if I seem quieter sometimes, understand that silence doesn't mean distance. If I seem thoughtful, it doesn't mean I'm searching for reasons to leave. Sometimes, I'm simply trying to understand the magnitude of something I didn't expect. Sometimes I'm learning how to hold something without squeezing it too tightly. Sometimes I'm reminding myself that not everything meaningful needs to be solved. And sometimes I'm just appreciating the strange fact that you exist in my life at all. Because there are people you meet and immediately understand why they are there. Then there are people who make you question the entire architecture of your understanding. You are the second kind, and maybe that is why this has stayed with me. You didn't fit into an existing category. You made me realize the category was too small. That is a rare thing, and rare things deserve attention. Not obsession, not fear, attention. So I am paying attention to what changes, to what remains, to what grows naturally, to what feels forced, to what feels honest, to who we are when neither of us is trying to impress the other, because that is where the truth will eventually appear. Not in the most beautiful words, not in the most intense moment, not in the things we imagine, in consistency, in reality, in how we continue to treat each other when the novelty fades, in whether the understanding survives ordinary days, in whether silence remains comfortable after there is nothing exciting to talk about, in whether we can disagree without losing respect, in whether we can be honest without creating fear. That is what I want to discover, not whether this can become some perfect story. Perfect stories aren't real. I want to know whether this can become something honest, something that doesn't require either of us to perform, something that can survive being ordinary. Because if something is truly meaningful, It shouldn't only exist in extraordinary moments. It should survive Tuesday afternoons, tired conversations, bussy days, misunderstandings, silence distanced, normal life. That is where I want to see what this is. Not because I doubt it, because I respect it enough to let reality test it. And maybe that is the final shift. I used to think protecting something meant keeping it untouched. Now I think protecting something can mean allowing it to exist honestly, allowing it to breathe, allowing it to be tested, allowing it to change, allowing it to become something different from what you imagined. That is difficult, but perhaps real things are always difficult in ways fantasies aren't. A fantasy can be perfect because you control it. Reality is meaningful because you don't. And I think I'm finally ready to stop choosing only what I can control. Not completely. Not recklessly, but enough to let something real have a chance. Enough to admit that I don't have every answer. Enough to say that you matter without knowing exactly what that means 5 years from now. Enough to stay curious without turning curiosity into expectation. Enough to trust the present without demanding a guarantee from the future. That is where I am, and maybe this is not a confession. Maybe it is simply an acknowledgement that something changed, that I changed, that the way I see you is no longer the way I saw you in the beginning, and the way I see myself is no longer exactly the same either. You became part of the story before I decided you should. You entered the space before I consciously opened it. And somehow, instead of feeling like an invasion, it feels like recognition. Like finding a door in a room I thought I already knew completely. Like discovering that there was always another side. I don't know what is behind it, but I know I'm no longer pretending the door isn't there. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. No promises, no declarations, no attempt to force a future into existence, just honesty. You matter. You reached somewhere inside me. You changed something in the way I understand myself. And whatever this becomes from here, I don't want to dishonor it by pretending it never happened. Because it did. It happened quietly. It happened without permission. It happened without a plan. And somehow, it became one of the clearest things I have felt in a very long time. Maybe clarity doesn't always arrive as an answer. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of a question. I'm no longer asking whether you affected me. I know you did. I'm no longer asking whether this connection is real. I know something real exists. I'm no longer asking whether I should have kept more distance. Maybe I should have. Maybe I shouldn't have. It doesn't matter now. Because distance would not erase what has already been understood. And I'm no longer asking whether I can return to who I was before. I can't. Not completely. Because once someone makes you aware of a part of yourself, you cannot become unaware again. You can ignore it, you can bury it, you can distract yourself. But you cannot honestly say you never saw it. I saw it, and I saw it because of you. That is something I will carry, regardless of what happens next. Maybe that sounds like too much. Maybe it is. But I would rather be honest about something meaningful than comfortable inside something false. So I'll stop trying to make this smaller. I'll stop pretending that because it has no official name, it has no significance. I'll stop demanding that every meaningful thing arrive with an explanation. Some things simply arrive. Some people simply reach you. Some moments simply alter the direction of your thinking. And sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is recognize the change instead of fighting it. So, I recognize it. I recognize you. I recognize what exists here. I recognize the way your presence has become part of my internal world, and I recognize that I allowed it. Maybe that is the most important truth. You didn't take this place. I gave it to you without realizing I was giving anything. And now that I realize it, I don't feel the need to take it back. I only want to understand why it feels so natural for you to be there. Maybe I'll understand someday. Maybe I won't. Maybe the answer will reveal itself through time rather than words. Until then, I can remain here, not waiting for you to become something, not asking you to prove anything, not expecting you to carry the weight of what I feel, just allowing the connection to exist as honestly as it can, because sometimes the deepest form of care is not holding tighter. It is holding gently enough that something can remain itself, and if this is meant to become more, it will. If it is meant to change, we will recognize that too. If it is meant to remain exactly as it is, then maybe that will be enough. But whatever happens, I know one thing now. You are no longer just a person I happened to meet. You became part of the way I understand certain things, part of the way I notice, part of the way I question, part of the way I see silence, part of the way I understand recognition, and perhaps most unexpectedly, part of the way I understand myself. That is not something I can undo, and honestly, I don't think I want to, because there are changes you spend your life trying to avoid. And then there are changes that make you realize the person you were protecting so carefully might have been waiting for exactly this, for someone to arrive without forcing the door, for someone to see without demanding, for someone to understand without simplifying, for someone to remain without trying to possess. Maybe that is what you did. Maybe that is why I stayed. Maybe that is why I'm still here. Not because I have no fear. I do. Not because I have all the answers. I don't. Not because I know what tomorrow will look like. I couldn't possibly know. I'm here because, for once, uncertainty doesn't feel like a reason to leave. It feels like an invitation to discover. And maybe that is the most honest place I have ever reached with another person. Not certainty, not control, just willingness. The willingness to see what happens when two people stop trying to define every moment and simply remain honest inside it. So, I won't promise that I understand everything. I won't pretend I know what this becomes. I won't turn this into a perfect story just because the feeling is difficult to explain. I will only say what I know. Something happened between us. Something quiet. Something unexpected. Something that changed the way I see you. Something that changed the way I see myself. And somewhere along the way, without either of us announcing it, you became familiar. Not because I knew your entire story, not because we had years of history, not because I could predict you, but because something about the way you exist made sense to something inside me. And maybe that is what recognition really is. Not knowing everything, just knowing enough to feel that you have found something you weren't looking for. That is you, something I wasn't searching for, something I wasn't prepared for, something I didn't plan, and somehow, something I'm no longer trying to escape. Maybe that is where this story actually begins. Not with the moment I noticed you, not with the first conversation, not with the first realization, but with the moment I stopped asking whether I should feel this way and started accepting that I already did. That moment changed everything, because acceptance doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it simply means refusing to lie to yourself anymore. And I'm done lying to myself about this. You matter. This matters. Whatever happens next, I want it to happen honestly, without pretending, without forcing, without fear, deciding everything before either of us gets the chance to see what this could become. Maybe that is all I needed to say. Not that I know where this goes, only that I'm willing to find out, and for someone like me, that willingness means more than any perfect declaration ever could.